Yes. Yeah, I'll start recording on my end too. Yeah.
And we'll just see if this
If it works out somehow.
yeah, could be good practice for me. We're streaming to Facebook.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, I just went to, there we go. I guess I do want all screen mode. Hold on. There we go. That's better. Hello, world.
Okay, let me look at this. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to press the button. And let's just make sure this works, and we'll give it a little time for.
Oh, sure.
Join in.
Absolutely. I know a few folks said they would be making it, so.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, where's your stream key? It just told me the stream key was wrong.
Let's see, it says starting, my wife just let me know that it says on her end, starting in 22 seconds a second ago.
Yeah.
So I guess something's working.
Oh, well, I set an event.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So I just need to find out where the stream key was because
wrong.
Profile. Come on. Advanced. Wasn't expecting that to be wrong.
Yeah.
That's wrong. Settings, here we are. Okay.
Yeah, I keep getting all these political texts. Go away.
Apply. Okay, well, let's try this one again. Oh yeah, I think we are actually connecting a live video.
Yay.
Which,
let's see. She keeps sending me messages here. Let me see what she says. Says the live video hasn't started on her end, but that may be a delay.
oh, I got to hit the button on this one too.
Oh, do you?
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. It's fine. It's technology. I've increased my competencies on so many different platforms just from COVID. So, you know, this was a most recent one. Books were about to fall over here. That's not good. Oh yeah, I'm seeing it just popped up on my Facebook that we're live.
Nice.
Yeah, she says, my wife says it's working, so I guess we're live.
Okay, we're going to share this into the group because we are broadcasting to the page.
Right.
Because Facebook.
Of course.
Post that and great. Okay, so let's we'll give people a few minutes to jump in as they're able.
Mm-hmm. I guess you're going to be the one to be able to see that. So you just let me know if somebody ends up having a question.
Yep, I am. Where now that we're live and we've been talking about this, I'll let anybody who's joined in
Yeah.
on it. This first time streaming to Facebook,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm used to doing Twitch, and
Yeah.
so I'm like looking to the right of the screen, going, "Where's the comment box? Where's the comment? Where is it?
Yeah.
Where do I find it? It's on the left."
Is it okay? Yeah. I've only used Twitch, I think maybe once. So yeah, familiar with that. Very cool.
All right. We got a few people trickling in. So
Hey.
very glad that y'all are here.
Hi, everybody.
So anybody who does join us, please do, since I am unfamiliar with these controls, let me know if we have some stream hiccups, any major problems. I'm not sure I could do anything about it, but it's part of being a man to like poke under the hood, even if you don't know what you're doing, right?
Exactly. That's right.
Something's broke down. You got to look under the hood.
Yeah. Just to make
It's
sure.
all poking things,
Let's see what's going on here. Yeah.
right? But yeah, Sarah and Leanne, welcome. Yeah, so we're good. People are jumping on. At least we have a few. So
Great.
why don't we get rolling? And of course, this is, the video will be available for anybody who was unable to join.
Mm-hmm.
We're definitely trying to make sure we get some backups going. We've for the Reformed Tolkien, we have had an interview before, but thankfully it was pre-recorded, and I still lost half. But for anybody, for those of you who are joining us, I'm Paul from the Reformed Tolkienian, but I'm not the reason you're here. We have with us author of a brand new book, Good News of the Return of the King, Michael Jahosky. Really glad that you could join us. This is a lot of fun. I was excited to see that when you posted in the group that that this book was coming out, and I'm really glad that I could get the opportunity to sit down and talk to you about it.
I appreciate the opportunity. I'm honored. Thank you.
Yeah. So, how did you get into Tolkien in the first place?
It's a great question. It's a bit of a long story, so I put it in the preface. Just
Nice.
to give a personal introduction to the book. The introduction is kind of the meat of the intellectual stuff, and I wanted to tell the story of how not only I kind of came to Christ, but also how I came to Tolkien. Those were interrelated. So I didn't know that they were, because when the movies were coming out in 2001, I was 16. So I'm dating myself now. And my brother, Chris, yeah, so everybody can do the math.
Hey,
So,
I didn't dox you doxed yourself.
I did. So my brother was reading me the books before. He's like, oh, I've read these before, and I'm like, oh, those movies look pretty awesome. We started reading The Fellowship and getting into it. And just recently, because it came out in December, right, in 2001. So my mom had recently become a Christian again. And the backstory here is that we were raised Catholic. And we had drifted from the church for a while. And then at 16, the movies were coming out. My mom had become a Christian again. And based on seeing how her life was changed and then just getting excited in these movies, that's my first exposure to Tolkien. And so I kind of started being a Christian again and started reading the books. Of course, I devoured all of them, including The Hobbit and The Silmarillion after at least The Fellowship came out. And I made it a yearly thing to read the books. So at the time, a lot of people do this, they read it every fall or every spring. I didn't know that those two things were related at the time. I'm saying all this with certainty now because I can look back and say, oh, retrospectively. So I didn't really think much of it at the time. And that's how I got into Tolkien. That's the first question, at least. There's more to it than that. And much later, starting in about 2010, 2011, and this gets into how I wrote the book and the idea behind it. I picked up a book by N.T. Wright called Simply Jesus. Some of you may have heard of it. I think it was published in 2011. And I'm reading this book. I'm in as an adjunct now at this time, and I'm reading this book, and I'm saying, this talk of Jesus becoming king and the heaven coming to earth, all of this sounds really familiar. And I'm like, where have I heard this before? And this story sounds very similar. And I was excited by the prospect of hearing Christianity being spoken about in that way. And I started to get confused. And I looked back and I thought, oh, this reminds me of the Lord of the Rings. And I started thinking Aragorn, and the connections just started firing. And there you have it. One thing led to another. There's more to the story, of course, but I think that's good for now. So
Right, yeah. And so, and you mentioned in there that that at that time you were an adjunct professor, right?
Yeah, when I discovered N.T. Wright's books around 2011.
All right.
Yep.
And you are currently professor?
Yes,
Okay.
full time at St. Petersburg College.
Okay, cool. And what is it you teach there?
So I teach humanities and fine arts. So my courses that I normally teach on rotation are Introduction to Humanities, Western Humanities Volume 1 and Volume 2, although the second class, I think people like the ancient stuff better. So I'm more often teaching that, ancient and medieval. And then third class, which is my absolute favorite, it's called East-West Synthesis. And so it's kind of hard to describe, but the name kind of gives it away. We compare cultures, religions. There's a lot of that in the introduction of my book where I talk about Christianity and its relationship to other religions and myths that are told in those religions. And so, yeah, it's a class that's really perfect for that. So we do art, we do literature, and those are the three that keep me busy these days. Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah, and that ties in to Tolkien as well, because I'm sure you know, and if you don't know, then just nod. I'm sure, but the argument that was instrumental in bringing C.S. Lewis to the faith was that all these myths were like dark reflections of the truth.
That's right.
And the truth is in Jesus. And that was something that Tolkien himself was telling Lewis when Lewis was an atheist and then agnostic and finally Christian.
Yep, that's right. And I talk about that in my book extensively in the introduction. There's a whole section called Myth Became Fact, because for those of you that will probably no doubt be aware, Lewis wrote, I think in the early 40s, an essay called Myth Became Fact. And this was well over a decade and then some after he returned to Christianity. And it addresses that very talk that him and Hugo Dyson and Tolkien had on the grounds of Magdalen College in Oxford. So yeah, very instrumental argument. I call it the argument from myth, but I think I'm not the first to do this. I think many scholars have already written about that. So yeah, very interesting argument. So
yeah, I actually wrote when I was in college, I wrote a paper on that as well.
Oh, cool.
And it was chosen for me to read it. I forgot what symposium it was, but something. It was a lot of fun.
To read it if you still have it hanging around.
I think I probably do. For some reason, I kept all my papers from college, which is probably a mistake.
Well, yeah. I mean, I've got a few laying around myself. I'm not gonna lie. So, and old notebooks. I guess I get a little nostalgic. So, like, oh, this is how I took notes back then. Highlight everything. That's the way. Good stuff.
Well, you sent me some information on the book, and so this just hit like this week. This was like Tuesday or something, right?
The 15th, the book came out. Yep. So
15th. Okay. All right. So it's been 10 days.
Yeah, exactly.
It has been a 2 weeks for me. So
I know it.
10 days ago, 3 days ago, it's all the same.
Yeah.
So, in full disclosure for everybody watching, unfortunately, I haven't gotten a chance to read it yet. You were nice enough to provide me some information that I thought was really, really interesting, and I'm really excited to read it. And that's one of the reasons I was excited to talk to you.
Thank you.
But the argument from the book, and and as a little bit of background, people like um, really get into the kind of myth versus allegory type argument, and Tolkien. I think and I think you do too. I think people misunderstand Tolkien on this point.
Yep.
And he had several criticisms for Narnia. that was one of them. That it was just kind of a blatant allegory. And but yeah, your argument is that it's a parable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can you go into a little bit of that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the introduction and the first chapter of the book are the technical aspects of the book. The fun chapters, not that that isn't fun, but the controversial stuff is up front. And it is very,
We appreciate that. We
yeah, yeah, you're welcome.
get mad at
So
you right off the bat.
if you can get through that though, you will get through it. I think it's dense, but it's interesting. And it is a contentious issue in Tolkien studies. So there are many steps to this. In fact, I've been drawing diagrams for myself now because I'm like seeing it so clearly now. So I'm going to be pulling up one of these because visuals are helpful, and I didn't want to bog the book down with them, but I'm happy to provide one for anybody who's interested. But yeah, the basic starting point is that Tolkien didn't give us an allegory in the popular sense that most people define allegory as saying this but meaning that.
Right.
Like, oh, well, this is just a fictional version of a story you've already heard called the Bible. Well, that's not what he's done at all. And that, of course, is what he called the conscious and intentional allegory. In letter 131 in the collection of letters by Humphrey Carpenter that were edited by him, excuse me, he mentions this in a letter to Milton Waldman. And he says, okay, here, this is the kind of allegory I dislike. Okay. But in several other places, which people are not aware of, and I'm grateful to Joseph Pierce, who's a Tolkien scholar who I've been talking with, who pointed this out in his book. But Tolkien did in another letter admit that his story is an allegory, just not the kind of allegory of atomic power that a lot of people thought it was, or even the Bible.
Right.
So he said, well, it's not an allegory of that, but it is an allegory, but oh, never mind. And he doesn't go into it. And then, elsewhere, he says several other things about allegorical interpretations. And so it gets very confusing very quickly. So what I try to do is rearrange the landscape with familiar terms and say most of our popular conceptions of words like myth, allegory, parable, metaphor, or even the word allegorical we can throw in there are all very convoluted, and they're used in very different ways. And they're also very polyvalent terms that take on different meanings based on who's talking, and it just gets very confusing. So I'll break it down for you all in this way. So basically, the argument is that we know that Tolkien called The Lord of the Rings a fairy story. We also know he identified it as an allegory. So what we draw from that, step one, is that the fairy story is a type of allegory, but it is opposite on the spectrum from the kind he did not like, which is the conscious, heavy-handed, preachy, intentional kind. So if you imagine a spectrum, if you will, on one end you have the conscious and intentional. He does not like this kind, and we can go into reasons later why. But just words like preachy and over heavy-handed. And yes, we beeline to the Chronicles of Narnia, some parts of it for this, but you can also think of John Bunyan, or even I'm trying to think of another great example here off the top of my head, but maybe you can help me out. But I can't recall another really transparent one, but that's a popular example. So we put those over to the side. You know what I'm talking about. These are the heavy-handed, preachy stories. They're on one end. On the other end is the fairy story, which he implies, based on what he says in his letters, is another type of allegory, far and away different from the other one. But here's the connection to parable. Here's really interesting. Father Robert Murray, who was a Jesuit priest and knew Tolkien, in the Tolkien centenary in 1992, gave a sermon celebrating the 100th year of after the birth of Tolkien in 1892, a Thanksgiving sermon called Tolkien and the Art of the Parable. And it's in a compilation edited by Joseph Pierce. By the way, for those of you interested, it's in the bibliography, but it's called Tolkien, A Celebration. And there's a great essay in there. You need to read it. My book does, I think, a lot of it justice, but you need to read it. And he says, the title gives it away. In many places, if not in most places in Tolkien's mythology, we see evidence of what Murray calls the art of the parable. So I started thinking, oh, this is all very interesting, but now we're adding another term to the list. This is so confusing. How the heck am I going to resort all this? Because, people, let me pause here for a moment. People are coming to the table with preconceived notions of what an allegory is, what
Right.
metaphor is. And you know this as well as I do. It's hard sometimes to reteach or unteach and then reteach people what they need to know. So I understand, and I know that a lot of you reading the book are going to be like, oh my gosh, I thought this was so simple. Apologies, it's not. But I try to simplify. So it's like, uh, I really wanted to. I tried to, and I think this is as simple as we're going to get. And of course, I'm not saying that it's the only argument you should listen to, because it's not. You need to read widely. Definitely check out that Tolkien and the Art of the Parable essay by Murray. So he talks in this essay about how the fairy story, Tolkien may have been self-conscious of the unbaptized roots of fairy story, he said, and he thinks that he really wanted to call this a parable. And we can see influence from Jesus, his Lord, in the way he told the story. So if I had, all sorts of things going off in my head at this point. So I put it all together, and this is what I came to a conclusion. Okay, let's just assume, for the sake of argument, we have a spectrum of allegory. It seems that Tolkien operated from one. And I go into all this in the introduction, chapter 1. Okay, so we start with a category called allegory. Within that category, there is a very transparent, heavy-handed, explicit, preachy form of the allegory that he did not like. On the other end, we have the fairy story, which also happens to be synonymous with, or at least analogous to, similar to, the New Testament parables of Jesus. So for a time in my book, I kind of do I think I do it a lot, actually, because I didn't want people to get confused, but parable / fairy story. But really, I'm kind of suggesting you can say one or the other. So if it's easier for you to just say parable, then now that we've talked, you can just say that. But this story I describe as being very different from the other kind of allegory. So the conclusion we come to, based on evidence from the mouth of the author himself and scholars who have studied him a great deal more than I have, and have been doing this a lot longer, we can come to the conclusion that Tolkien was not afraid of allegory, and he wasn't. He doesn't need to be saved from it, in the words of one scholar. He wasn't writing one kind, but he was writing another kind, and it was modeled on the art of the parable. And I love that phrase, because it just kind of says there's a way to tell a story that is not the way that Tolkien disliked. And so now we want to know, well, what does that entail, right? And so that's it. And so we break that down for you. And then I get into how to interpret the story properly so that we don't turn it into the wrong kind of allegory. And I talk about the characteristics. I talk about how it works on us. I talk about what things to do and not do with it, and so on and so forth. So one last thing I would say to this is that, and it's an interesting comment about the word allegorical. Obviously, allegories are going to have allegorical components, but what Tolkien said about interpreting, let's just say, a parable, is, you have to be aware that allegorical interpretations of any myth, any story in the broadest sense, that's what myth means, is impossible to avoid. Everybody, there's no self-interpreting literature. So the book doesn't tell you how to read it. It doesn't do it for you. And we all have different worldviews and come from different denominations, or maybe you're not a believer. And so you're going to bring your own baggage to it. But the thing that we all have in common is that we all are going to interpret, what does this story mean? You can't not do that. So he does warn us about that. And he says that fairy is perilous to enter for that reason. Yeah, as you know. So I'll stop for now.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Does that
No, that's very cool. And it's like I've often enjoyed watching, the whole allegory debate.
Oh yeah.
Just because a lot of people don't seem to realize that Tolkien wrote at least 2 allegories. So
obviously, Nigel too. Yeah.
And but yeah, and he tells us, like, explicitly on fairy stories, that the whole structure of the fairy story that culminates in the eucatastrophe is reflective of the gospel.
In plain terms, absolutely does. He and
And
at the epilogue, excuse me, he says the Gospels contain a fairy story, or perhaps the greatest fairy story that encompasses and makes sense of all the other fairy stories. And there he's talking about understanding Christianity as a narrated worldview that makes sense of not just the world, but other worldviews. And he's talking about its power to, even in imaginative settings like Middle Earth, to make sense of things in clear, concise ways. So it's like you said, it's very plain that he says that, very plain. And in his letters too, he says, as you know, you seem to have read them. So and if you don't know, folks, he says the Lord of the Rings, and he just says this of the Lord of the Rings, and just we haven't gotten to the other books, but he says it is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. Elsewhere, he says, I have deliberately created this story out of certain, he doesn't say what, religious ideas. And so on and on it goes. It's just more mounting evidence. He was upset when no Catholic reviewers, magazines reviewed his book initially. So that kind of tells you something.
yeah, yeah, yeah. In years ago when we first started this group, and I went up to my old alma mater and interviewed Dr. Lou Marcos for this. He said two things related to this. First of all, and I think this is plain, is that the primary virtue for Tolkien in his work is hope, and hope just permeates this. Lord of the Rings particularly, and Douglas Wilson said that this was actually the real difference between Lord of the Rings and something like Game of Thrones.
Oh yeah.
Is that okay? Yes, we have magic. Yes, we have medieval warfare and people dying, but one is centered on hope as a Christian virtue,
right?
And the other one is based on nihilism.
Oh my gosh, yes. As well written as those books are, it's definitely a nihilistic universe.
Yeah,
Beyond a shadow.
And I mean this is one of the reasons that Dr. Marcos said that this was one of the I think he said handful of the best Christian works of history, and specifically that it was a Christian work, is besides the reflections of the gospel, the advancement of Christian virtue, like hope.
Yep. He has a great book on that. Yeah.
It just permeates these things.
Oh yeah, it does, most definitely.
And so that's in many other places is where I do think Tolkien is very intentionally, bringing that Christian worldview into the story itself. And of course, the stuff that he just explicitly says, his work on the concept of the eucatastrophe, the undeserved twist, the happy catastrophe.
It's interesting. There are several things you said that just made me think of some other things we should probably mention. So all of that is true, but elsewhere in his letters, he also says that the Lord of the Rings was only unconsciously Christian at first, but consciously Christian in the revision. That is, only by looking back on his on the completion of the Lord of the Rings did he fully understand how his books, including The Hobbit and the Silmarillion, which had not yet been published, all fit together. And this is something else I talk about in my book, is the necessity of looking back. And I'm standing on the shoulders of Dr. Marcos and many others in saying this, but Dr. Christopher Scarf, who I think is based in the UK, also wrote a really big book about the Inklings. And there's several chapters about Tolkien. And he says that the necessity of looking back from Aragorn to The Hobbit and the Silmarillion is parallel to the necessity of looking back. We think of Jesus on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24 here, looking back from the resurrected, risen Jesus back to the Old Testament, and searching the scriptures to find him there. And I was greatly encouraged by Richard B. Hayes's book, Echoes of the Scriptures, for this retrospective approach. And that Tolkien himself kind of advocates it in his letters. And he says, I think part of the attraction to the Lord of the Rings is this looming great sense of history that's beckoning you in the background. When Aragorn is telling the tale of Beren and Luthien and Weathertop, for example, and that's a very critical scene for a number of other reasons. But he thought that by he says elsewhere in a letter, in that same letter, I think, that we need to treat that backstory that we're looking back at like an island on the horizon that's glittering just over the distance, and we need to keep the enchantment. We can't sail there, he says. We need to keep the tantalizing features of the story, and so you can't sail there and go and explain it. You have to let readers unpack it and figure out the way that the works are interconnected. So that's another way that the mythology that Tolkien wrote resembles the Bible, is that Jesus tells us to read Scripture by retrospectively and by looking for prefigurations, types, typological prefigurations, rather than starting with the Old Testament and looking for predictions. And I go into why that's an important thing to do in my book too. So that's another way that the story, as you have said so nicely, reflects the gospel.
Yeah.
And that's great. I also mentioned the eucatastrophe once or twice. There were some other things that came up there, but that I just had to say, I think that's so fascinating.
Yeah, I do love that, and especially it's especially fascinating to me that, like, when when readers were first reading Lord of the Rings, when it first came out, and I forgot all the stuff that Gandalf says on the bridge in front of the Balrog, but he spouts some stuff that sounds really impressive, and there's no way for readers to have any foggiest clue what he's talking about. No way. But then now that we have the Silmarillion, and we can look back on some stuff, and just the way that, like when Frodo is offering the ring to Galadriel, and you're thinking about what the elves did, and you're like, oh no, don't do that. Your first reading, you're like, yes, she's perfect, and then you're like,
you'll be fine. Yeah.
No, that's not good. Don't do that.
Yeah, not a good idea. Yeah, and I talk about the Silmarils and Fëanor in the Silmarillion, and his thirst for vengeance against Melkor or Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, and obviously parallels to not just Satan but evil forces in general that are described demonically in the Bible. But very interesting. There's that, and then the stuff about you said about the bridge in Moria with Gandalf. It's really interesting to know that they're both Maya. They're part of the.
Yes.
He's a Maiar. The Balrog is a Maiar. And they're fighting each other as equals in a sense. They're now, I know this is another thing that comes up, and I'm also greatly indebted to Dr. Marcos for pointing this out, as well as Mike Heiser, whose book, I just finished a Bible study on Mike Heiser's the book, The Unseen Realm, with some family friends and such. And I take the tack that for those of you that don't know, in the Silmarillion, God, Iluvatar in the Silmarillion creates like a divine council of the Valar and the Maiar, and I suggest, rather than see them as the Trinity or as archangels and angels, or it's even been suggested, other things have been suggested, like the characteristics of God, see them as the Psalm 82 in the Bible's divine council, that God, lower Elohim, lower deities that are lesser than God. And so when you think about it in those terms, in those biblical terms, if that's really what the ancient Israelite authors mean, and I think that's what the scholars are telling us, then Gandalf fighting a Balrog is like a council member against another council member in the mythological terms. And that's a reward for the reader. Like, you just went and did all this reading in a book that's very hard to read, the Silmarillion, and now you have this rich new reading to kind of produce for yourself. So I talk about all that. And Mike Heiser is very popular right now. His book is really making a lot of waves. And Dr. Marcos wrote a great review. And, by this time the book had already been done. And I'm like, wow, he sees it too. And I felt encouraged, because when I was writing, I was like, oh my God, what if I'm the only one arguing this and I'm laughed at? But you have to take that chance. And I'm like, he even said he'll read this review. And I said, wow, this is great. Like, I see this too. And it's great when more and more Christians are recognizing this new way of, we say it's new, but this new way of looking at Scripture, that God had a counsel that works for him in the Bible. And what that does for us theologically, I talk a little bit about it in the book. So for those of you that I've, interested about that,
Yeah.
uh, you'll be treated to some of that for sure. Very,
That's super cool.
it is.
I actually convinced the men's group at my church
Ah,
to read Eindalundele
oh,
for for one of our meetings, and everybody adored it. If you have not read Silmarillion,
yeah,
just do two things.
yeah,
Just get
yeah.
it
Mm-hmm.
and read the first chapter, which is the creation myth, the Eindalundele, and it is literally the most beautiful thing I've ever read in my life.
I agree.
It is, and it is so incredibly well written. But that read it out loud,
Yes,
because
yes.
it's even better that way.
It's like Shakespeare.
And do that with the entire Silmarillion. It is easier. It's a tough book. It's a thick. It's
Oh yeah.
the text is thick.
Yes.
But read it out loud, and the first time you read it, don't worry too much about the names.
Mm-hmm.
Just go through it. Just read it out loud, and things will go into place. Don't worry about the 5 billion names in there.
And there are that many. Yeah.
Um,
It's so true. And somewhere in chapter 5, the last chapter of the book, when we're talking about the debate of Finrod and Andrath, which is yet another dialogue that a lot of people aren't familiar with, and I didn't know how to pronounce it, Ainulindale. That's how I kind of came to it. But the creation myth. So
just say it confidently. I don't know that I'm right, but
the Ainulindale is the creation myth, and I say in there that I've often recommended the cosmogony, the creation myth that Tolkien has in the Silmarillion for my students who are looking for a mythological, imaginative answer to the problem of evil and to this divine council stuff and the relationship of God and all these really dense theological concepts. Predestination and foreknowledge are also things, they're not the same thing. And yet we go back and forth on this. And we have lots of talks in the church. And all of these really complicated theological ideas are translated into poetic terms. And they make much more sense. Not that the theology is good. We've got fantastic theologians out there. But if you're looking for more of a mythos explanation rather than a logos explanation, read the Ainulindale, and you will not be sorry.
right.
I agree with Paul. Yes.
Yeah, and just the way everything is created in that story is that it is like in Lewis actually. It is sung.
Yes.
And the way it's described, that Melkor comes in and tries. I think he uses this phrase, sow discord into the song.
That's it.
And only to find that the things he was singing were there anyways.
Yeah, they're there. Yeah, he says nothing you can do, is really apart from me, and anything that you do will redound unto me and will play into my master plan. And it's beautiful. You're so right. And you think of Aslan singing. Spoiler alert for those of you who haven't read him. The Magician's Nephew. It's
been like 70 years.
I know. That's true. Yeah.
If you haven't read Narnia, that's on you.
Yeah, that's true. I get in a lot of trouble with my family though sometimes for spoiling things. So I'm trying to be better about this. I'm getting help. Don't worry. So I've gotten better. But yeah, it's a really beautiful story. And oh, this is the other thing I was going to mention. We got on something earlier about the hope. You said, I agree with Dr. Marcos and with yourself about hope prevailing in the Lord of the Rings. But I've also pointed out, and I disagree with some Tolkien scholars on this, that like Matthew Dickerson wrote a book where he argues that because it's a sad story, it's not a story with the incarnation in it. And I disagree. I taught this is where parables come in. And so my take is that we've misunderstood sometimes, I think, how to understand what the incarnation is. And so what I argue is, I guess this is step one of what I have to tell you, the incarnation should be understood in terms of mythos, right? Of God becoming king. These stories of a father with two sons and a woman searching for a lost coin, etc., are all these stories about the exiled Israel and the exiled Messiah coming back to his throne and God bringing heaven to earth. And I say that along with N.T. Wright, who's written very confidently about this, among others, Timothy Keller too, that the return of the king is the incarnation. And so, and not only that, but using Bradley Berzer's excellent book too, he makes a case that Manwe, one of the Valar, is Iluvatar, God's divine council representative in Middle Earth, and Aragorn serves Manwe. And so there's this connection, God becoming king. So I make that connection. That's the first part. The second thing is, I think the stories are sad because the incarnation is present. Now, realistically, we as Christians know, Tolkien writes this in On Fairy Stories, that the Christian still, he says, has to work and suffer and die, but we do so with a greater purpose of knowing what all of our work is going to lead to. I argue based on that the yes, the Lord of the Rings was filled with hope, but it's a sad story because it's an unfinished one. And it's sad because God came in and died. Now, does he die and rise the same way as he does in the Gospels? No. But he, that is, Aragorn goes through the past of the dead. He commands the dead. Even the harrowing of hell is kind of brought up here, and so on and so forth. And so I think that, and then Tolkien doesn't even say Aragorn dies. He falls asleep is what is suggested, kind of Arthurian-like, and so I think that the stories are sad precisely because God has come. We look at our own world. People say all the time to me, Paul, I'm sure you get it a lot too. My students are like, well, look, Jesus didn't clean up the world. Heaven on earth, my you know what? And I said, okay, well, I hear you. Let's talk about it. And it's a good thought. And I think people should be encouraged to have it. It doesn't look like God has set up heaven on earth, but he has. And yet we need to understand, and I know you'll probably agree that life is still tragic, and it's still filled with suffering and sad. And the story is one of already and not yet, which I also talk about. So I disagree with some other major Tolkien scholars, and maybe, I'm stepping on some toes. I think that's what scholarships do. We contribute and help each other. So I'm hoping a new look at this subject might shed some new light on it. And that's the tack that I take. So.
Yeah, that's very cool. That's very cool.
Thank you.
While we're on Aragorn, himself, which, it's been pointed out that there's several Christ figures in the book, but Aragorn is the Christ figure.
Indubitably.
And Viggo, what's his last name? Mortensen?
Yeah, Mortensen. Yeah.
Yeah. His portrayal of Aragorn is the best thing ever.
Agreed.
But that being said, and I can't even think about Aragorn without thinking of him anymore because he was so good.
No, I agree.
But even that being said, they toned him down in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
He is, in the books, he is just this presence of power, of competence,
mm-hmm.
of humility,
mm-hmm.
of kindness. He is everything, and you feel it in the books when he's around.
Ooh.
And it very much reflects on the way, people around Christ, that it mentions in the gospel who is this who says these things?
Exactly.
That's the sense you get.
That's right. And I talk a lot about what I call these transfiguration moments, and other Tolkien scholars have touched on it before, but not to the extent that I feel that I have. So I feel like that's one of the things that's unique about the book. I counted, and it's probably not right, but I mentioned at some point at least 19 moments where Aragorn is described as going through some sort of transformation. And these are not depicted in the films at all. Maybe a few times, but when he shouts his ancestor's name, Elendil, when he's helping the hobbits get to Mordor, a little bit, but it's still toned down. But the scene when they're coming through the Argonath in the first film, those two great big statues, for those of you who don't know, with the river Anduin that they're sailing down, they do capture a little bit of the wistfulness of his face. But I think what they should have done is, because in the book, Frodo and the other hobbits are looking at him and they're describing him as a king returning from exile. You can't help but hear the gospel there. And I just am reminded, I'm pulling up my book.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't got my paperback copies yet. Whipped in stock. I'm just kidding. it's for good reason, I'm sure, and I think it takes a little while. So I'm just kidding. I got it on Kindle, but there's which is great that we have that, right? So there's
Yeah.
a book that Peter Kreft wrote called The Philosophy of Tolkien, which is in the bibliography for those of you that look at those. And he says, and this is on page 10, so this is probably still the introduction here. Let me just double check. No, it's in the preface, excuse me. So in the preface, toward the end of the preface, I quote Kreft is saying this. He says, though we do not have kings in America or want them, our unconscious mind both has them and wants them. We all know what a true king is, a real king, an ideal king, an archetypal king. Something in us longs to give him our loyalty and fealty and service and obedience. He is lost, but longed for, and will someday return. And I say after this, after reading this, I felt slightly less crazy because I sensed this. I think Timothy Keller once said it like, you just want to throw yourself at the feet of Jesus and say, tell me what to do, command me. And when you read about Aragorn, it makes your skin crawl in the very best way. You get goosebumps, the heart starts pumping, and you're drawn to this character in the book. And I try to explain why that is in my book. And I think that Kreft's explanation here is that it taps into something deep in our unconscious that maybe we've suppressed. And I talk about why that might be. I'm not a psychologist, but I don't think I need to be to comment on this, that we almost as Americans, it's kind of ingrained in us to despise monarchy and the very language that even the title of my book, or N.T. Wright's books where he writes, How God Became King. I've got it on my shelf over here. It's a title that's like, well, what does that even mean? You
Yeah.
know? But I think his explanation, Peter Kreft's explanation, which by the way, I love your books if you're out there, he just nails it. He says what you've always been thinking and that you didn't have the words for it. And so I'm grateful for one, to put this on paper because it helped me work through why is this story affecting me so much? And everybody that's probably listening knows that the Lord of the Rings it haunts you in a way that you can't, you're like, I don't know why that is, but it just does. And I think it's because of the gospel. It's a sad and wonderful story all at once, a painful and beautiful story. So anyway, yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. This didn't really fit in anywhere, but I years and years and years ago, I was listening. I think it was, and I'd never be able to find it again, but like a question and answer with Tim Keller.
Oh, cool.
And he and I'm going to butcher the quote because again, it's been years and I'll never find it. But I think he said that the Bible is a story with a title, and the title is Return of the King.
Well said. Yeah,
And
I'm so glad you're alone. Yeah.
I also remember the Babylon Bee article about how Tim Keller had finally finished his translation of the Bible into Elfish. So,
Oh my God. No, he didn't really.
no, he didn't. No.
Okay. Oh man. Yeah, see, I'd believe that. That's awesome. I know he's a big fan. And like I kind of said earlier, I don't speak Elvish and or Dwarfish, I know I'm not even saying it right. I'm not a language expert. So for those of you out there that are wincing, I'm sorry. But yeah. Anyway, that's great. And like I said, I'm not the first person to capture this theme, and the Bible has been saying it for millennia. This is the story of God becoming king. So none of us really can deserve credit for pointing it out. God left it in the Bible. And I think it's wonderful once you see how it all comes together, that the fact that God has come back and he set up his kingdom, he promises to make everything right again. That's good news. The return of the king is good news. And that's the simplest way we can put it. But I wrote a whole book about why I think it's a good and beautiful and true and hopeful message for all of us. Whether we believe it or not subjectively is irrelevant. Many of us can be in denial about things, but if we're to take Christianity seriously, even if we don't like what I just said, we have to say, okay, well, what is the Bible and what are Jesus claiming? Well, that's what they're claiming. So you can't say that that's not what they meant. No, that's what they meant. You are allowed to disagree with it, and some of us do. I know I've wrestled with it, but what you can't say is, well, they didn't say that. You can disagree with them. You don't have to like it, but that's just good philosophy, And anyway, I think it has and Tolkien on fairy stories, he says in terms I wouldn't put it, but he's right. Rejecting the story of Christ leads either to what does he say, wrath or sadness, or the other way around. So he's very plain about that. But anyway,
Yeah.
there it is. Very good.
Yeah. Well, it reflects what our attitude also should be like, especially right now, because I don't know if you noticed, but 2020, some stuff has happened.
What? No, I had no.
Oh, I'll send you some news articles.
Yeah, could you? What's
But
news? Yeah.
but at the end of Lord of the Rings, it's like the entire world now has been just demolished,
Yeah.
and like half the trees are now gone. All there's been all these war paths and land ripped up, and so many people are dead, and you're right. It is in that sort of way a very sad story, and that sadness lingers with people like Frodo going forward. But you also walk away as you're walking back to the Shire with that idea of, well, it's okay now.
Yeah.
And why do we think that?
Right.
Because Aragorn. Exactly. Aragorn's on the throne.
That's right.
And in that also is the hope of the Christian, that it's like, okay, yes, we have literal plagues. We're teetering on the brink of civil war.
That's
this election, it does not look like it's going to go well so far.
No, very divisive.
But it's okay now.
Yeah.
I mean, with all this stuff, it's okay now because Christ is on his throne.
That's it. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, I think in verse 25 or 26, Christ must keep on reigning until he puts all enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be defeated is death. And we know that's what the resurrection, of course, and we have to die just like Jesus did. And just as Jesus did, so will we. Jesus, he's the first fruits, Paul says earlier in that chapter. And yet that verse I just quoted, it's okay now, as you said, because God is reigning through Christ, and every knee shall bow, and acknowledge the lordship of Jesus. Philippians 2. So you've got those great Pauline epistles kind of supporting what you just said. And that's what the good news is. Now, part of accepting good news, though, is a story of already and not yet. As a German scholar, there's a German scholar who coined this. I think he's in one of the endnotes because I wanted to make sure I credited where this came from. But it's been passed around for many years now. And knowing that it's a story that's, already things are starting to get better, but it's not yet better completely, is a good story. It's hopeful, but it's also, we get some gritty realism in there.
Yep.
And exactly. It's a nasty world out there right now. And so I'm also hoping, and I want to just say this at this stage in the conversation, that I wrote the book in some senses for myself, because I was reading a lot of books that I was hoping would explain, as I say this in my preface, explain what the Lord of the Rings was doing to me in terms that make sense, right? And I'm like, I wanted to write a book that was finally going to scratch that itch for me, because the books I were reading were fantastic. And I've mentioned several authors, Joseph Pierce, Dr. Marcos, several others, who wrote books about Tolkien that did scratch the itch, but not all the way. And I feel like writing this book has really satisfied me and put things in a way that makes sense for myself as I wrestle as a Christian with the world at large. And a long way of saying to give myself hope. But as I say in the preface too, I want to give other people hope. And even though we have to wade through some technical stuff to do that, as most books like this on theology are a little technical, we get to the part where it's all about learning. The central part of the book is chapters 2.5 to the end, like halfway through chapter 2, and then the rest of the book is all about the already, the not yet, the good news, the reflections of the Gospels, probably the stuff that I'm going to just guess most excited about, right? Not the allegory stuff, but anyway, I hope you don't mind me saying that. It is for you guys. I wanted to share this book with people, but I needed to write it for me too, because I needed it. So I think a lot of authors feel that same way.
Oh yeah, no. And as somebody who writes, I would not. The reason I write and the reason I do music is because I want to tell the stories I want to read, and I want to play the music I like to listen to. That's
great.
if somebody else does it, if somebody else digs it,
That's a
great.
plus. I'm glad to feel that I'm not alone in that. So that's comforting. Good.
Yeah, maybe it's just the two of us. We might be the
Maybe
weirdos,
us. Yeah, which is
but
we'll maybe find
yeah.
more like minds. But
All right, so I got excited and chattered away for a lot longer than I intended. And I did, I knew for half the country we're still a little bit early on a weekday, and so I knew that we weren't going to get a ton of live visitors. But if you're catching us later, that's awesome. If you are with us live, and if the recording worked, then you are seeing the book right here. If we're going off the Zoom recorder, you're not seeing it, but it's obviously available at Amazon, and I just clicked off of it. Tell me the full title again. The good news about
the good news of the return of the King, the gospel in Middle Earth. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Okay. And so if anybody who is joining us live, if you have any questions in chat, we will post the video inside the Reformed Tolkienian group, and as well as on our page, which will be public. You're going to be able to see any questions that people put in later in both of those places. You're part of the group, and you'll have access to the post there. And so, if you're catching us not live, then by all means, throw some questions in there, and we'll try to catch it. When will the paperbacks or hardcover be available?
Yeah, so I just checked Amazon a few minutes ago, and I think they are still showing that they're available. But I think the issue is that they're maybe getting a lot of demand, and it's taking a couple weeks. And like I said, I haven't even gotten my copies yet, so I don't know what the holdup is there. I have to. It's Friday, so I have to talk to my publisher. I do need to speak with them on Monday. So that being said, I think just stay tuned. The ebook version, for those of you that I know you like the paperbacks. If you are crazy like me, sometimes your favorite books you buy digital and you have one that you can dog ear and highlight, but it should be within the week that they're available for paperback. I don't think I wasn't told if there's a hardcover edition, but it would be more expensive, and I think they're trying to keep the price reasonable. So probably just paperback and then Kindle. I even I do these crazy things sometimes, and because I'm in kind of charge, other than my sister who's and my wife who are both helping, I'm advertising the book. So I will sometimes do some giveaways, and as the paperback becomes available, I'll give some of those out, and Kindle editions. So stay tuned for that as well. But yeah,
Nice.
hopefully within the week for the paperback, I hope.
Great.
Yep.
Perfect. And if y'all order the paperback and you get it before Michael gets his, take a picture just to show it off and make him jealous.
Yeah. Just kidding. Yeah, it's okay. I have so many books, so it's been good to shrink down. I don't know how many scholars these days are doing it, but I have a Kindle that I just love. Ebooks are kind of my go-to nowadays. So that's just me, maybe.
Yeah, I'm in the middle of that transition myself, and it's I've resisted it, obviously, a very long time.
Yeah.
It just it is definitely more fun to hold the book in your hand, but it's a lot more convenient.
Yeah, it is. It's a fight. So some books I'll buy one in digital and one paperback. So for special books,
right.
Yep.
I do. There was a little bit of a quandary on this topic just recently, because I'm in Texas, and we were under threat of hurricane several weeks ago. It didn't hit us directly, so we were fine.
Thank God.
But I just realized that like my books, games, everything are all digital. And if we lose power for multiple days, I am in trouble.
Yeah, that's right. Therein lies the advantage of having the real thing. So
right.
Yeah, pros and cons to both, for sure.
So any other questions? I'm not seeing anything popping up.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, I really appreciate you hanging out with us,
Thank you.
and this was a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun. I'm honored to be on and just excited to share the book with you. So thank you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, uh, we will go ahead and shut down on our end, and hopefully make sure all of the